Stay with me for a moment because before we can understand what just happened, we have to remember why moments like this matter at all. History doesn't usually announce itself with a drum roll. More often, it turns on quiet decisions made by people standing inside institutions, deciding whether rules still mean something. It's November 1973. The country is already on edge. The Watergate investigation is closing in, and President Richard Nixon orders the firing of the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. The Attorney General refuses and resigns. The Deputy Attorney General refuses and is fired. Eventually, the Solicitor General carries out the order. That night becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. What people tend to forget isn't the chaos or even the scandal. It's the reason the system survived. The institutions didn't hold because they were indestructible. They held because individual people inside them chose principle over obedience. Courts kept issuing rulings. Congress kept investigating. Accountability moved forward, not quickly, not cleanly, but relentlessly. I'm telling you this because at 3:17 p.m. Eastern Time today, January 10th, 2026, another individual inside an American institution made a choice. And that choice may have altered the course of this republic. Judge Tanya Chutkan, a federal judge in Washington, D.C., did something unprecedented in nearly 2.5 centuries of American constitutional history. Something that did not happen during Watergate, Iran-Contra, the Clinton impeachment, or either of Donald Trump's previous impeachments. She formally referred evidence of criminal conduct by a former president of the United States directly to Congress and demanded immediate impeachment proceedings. Let me say that again because the scale of this matters. A sitting federal judge reviewed the evidence before her, 14 documented violations of court orders, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and concluded that the judiciary had exhausted its authority, that Congress could no longer wait, that the constitutional order itself was at risk. This is not rumor. It's not anonymous sourcing. It's a 47-page legal filing, publicly available, bearing the signature of a lifetime-appointed federal judge. And within roughly 72 hours, the House of Representatives will vote on whether Donald Trump becomes the first president in American history to be impeached 3 times. Now let me walk you through how we got here because the details always matter. Judge Chutkan presides over one of the federal criminal cases against Donald Trump. You've heard her name before. For months, she has been confronting something no federal judge has ever faced at this scale: a defendant who repeatedly, openly refuses to follow court orders. Federal judges have tools, limited ones, but real ones. They can issue warnings, impose fines, hold a defendant in contempt, in extreme cases revoke bail. But constitutional scholars have debated this question for centuries. What happens when none of those tools work? What happens when fines are meaningless to a wealthy defendant? When incarceration appears politically impossible? When warnings are treated like suggestions? That has been the trap Judge Chutkan has been stuck in for months. Gag orders violated. Witnesses contacted despite explicit prohibitions. Social media attacks on prosecutors, judges, and potential jurors. 14 times in 3 months. 14. Each time the court warned him. Each time contempt was cited. Each time fines were imposed. And each time the behavior continued. Today, Judge Chutkan stopped asking. She issued a formal criminal referral, essentially telling Congress, I have exhausted every tool I possess. This defendant poses a direct threat to the administration of justice. You must act now. Her language is worth quoting, because judges do not choose words lightly. The defendant's repeated violations constitute a clear and present danger to the administration of justice and demand immediate congressional intervention. Clear and present danger is not rhetorical flourish. It is a precise legal conclusion with enormous constitutional weight. And she didn't just send a summary. She sent the entire evidentiary record. That record includes 14 documented gag order violations, all time-stamped and archived, transcripts from 7 contempt hearings where Trump was personally warned, phone records showing coordination with co-defendants in violation of no-contact orders, social media posts targeting prosecutors, judges, and jury pools, internal communications from Trump's own legal team acknowledging violations, sworn declarations from former federal judges calling the conduct unprecedented. And then there is the most damaging evidence of all, recorded audio of Trump discussing plans to defy court orders with advisors. Not accidental misconduct, intent, planned violations followed by execution. This is the kind of evidence that ends political careers. And Congress received it in a single filing this afternoon. Here's why the history matters. This has never happened before. Not once in 249 years has a federal judge formally initiated impeachment proceedings against a president or former president. Through every crisis, no judge has ever concluded that Congress must be compelled to act immediately to preserve constitutional order. Judge Chutkan crossed that line today because judicial authority depends on enforcement. If court orders can be ignored without consequence, they stop being law. Not just in one case, but everywhere. She understood that continued tolerance wasn't neutral. It was eroding the judiciary itself. So she escalated, not out of politics, but necessity. The referral isn't partisan, it's institutional survival. And that matters, because Trump's central defense, that this is all political persecution, collapses when the accuser is a lifetime federal judge, Phil. Ng sworn evidence through constitutional channels. This wasn't leaked, it wasn't spun, it was procedure. Congress reacted faster than anyone expected. Articles of impeachment had already been drafted and sitting in committee since November 2025. 8 charges: obstruction, witness tampering, contempt of court, abuse of power, threats to constitutional order.br. Until today, they had 87 co-sponsors. Tonight, they have 231, a House majority. And the new names aren't progressives from safe districts. They're moderate Republicans from swing seats, lawmakers who defended Trump through prior impeachments. Representative Mike Lawler of New York said it plainly, "I swore an oath to the Constitution, not to any individual." Others followed. Leadership invoked a fast-track rule requiring a full House vote within 72 hours. By Monday, January 13th, the House will vote. At this point, impeachment is no longer a question of if, but how overwhelming. Trump's response has only accelerated the collapse. Since yesterday, he's posted non-stop claims of rigged courts, deep state conspiracies, attacks on judges. Then came the post that changed everything, bar, "If Congress moves forward with this witch hunt, patriots must converge on Washington. The Second Amendment exists for moments like this. BR law enforcement is treating it as a credible threat." Every post now becomes evidence. Every escalation strengthens the case against them. BR National Guard units are deployed. Barricades are up. Federal buildings are fortified. Demonstrators are gathering. Helicopters circle overhead. Washington looks like this not because of a foreign enemy, but because a former president is facing accountability and calling for resistance, and impeachment isn't the whole story. The referral also went to the Department of Justice. That means parallel criminal investigations, witness tampering, obstruction, contempt, new indictments could land While impeachment proceedings are underway, there are even quiet discussions of the 25th Amendment. I'm not predicting it, but the fact that it's being discussed tells you how severe this looks from inside government. The Republican Party is fracturing in public. Loyalists double down. Pragmatists defect. Threats escalate. With midterms months away, many see catastrophe in staying tethered to chaos. Once defections begin, they accelerate. Political coalitions don't dissolve slowly. They collapse all at once. Internationally, allies are alarmed. Adversaries are watching. Instability at home always echoes abroad, and for ordinary Americans, this isn't abstract. Markets react, trust erodes, safety becomes a daily concern. This is what constitutional crisis feels like in real life. Canceled plans, guarded streets, unanswered questions about what comes next. Whatever happens Monday, there is no return to normal, only forward through impeachment, trials, or deeper instability. So here's what to remember as the next 72 hours unfold. Institutions don't survive because they restrong on paper. They survive because in moments like this, people inside them decide the rules still matter. Is this conversation helpful so far? When people talk about American democracy, they tend to talk about the Constitution as if it's a machine, well-designed, self-correcting, almost automatic. If you follow the rules, outcomes emerge, checks balance power, the system holds. That story is comforting, but it's also deeply misleading. Institutions do not enforce themselves, they never have. They only function when the people inside them decide that the rules matter more than their own safety, ambition, or comfort. Strip away that human choice, and the institution is just paper and ceremony. This is not a romantic claim. It's a hard, empirical one. If you look carefully at moments of real stress, Watergate, the Civil Rights era, post-Civil War Reconstruction, you see the same pattern. The decisive variable is not design, it's behavior. When officials refuse unlawful orders, when judges enforce rulings despite backlash, when legislators accept political costs to uphold process, the system survives. When they don't, it degrades rapidly. There is no neutral ground. In moments of crisis, inaction is a choice, and it usually favors power. What makes Judge Chutkan's action so significant is not just its legal novelty, it's what it signals about institutional limits. She is effectively saying, I have done everything this institution allows me to do, and it is no longer sufficient. That's not a declaration of strength, it's an admission of fragility. Courts rely on compliance. They assume that orders will be followed because the legitimacy of the judiciary is broadly accepted. When a defendant decides that legitimacy no longer applies to him and faces no decisive consequences, the authority of the court begins to erode, not just in one case, but system-wide. This is where people get uncomfortable because it forces us to confront a basic truth. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires restraint by those with power. And restraint is not something you can code into a constitution. You can encourage it, you can reward it, but you cannot guarantee it. That's why the idea that the system will handle it is so dangerous. Systems don't handle defiance. People do. There's also a moral dimension here that we tend to avoid because it sounds old-fashioned. Accountability is not automatic. It depends on individuals accepting risk. When a judge escalates, when a legislator breaks party ranks, when an official says no, they are not following procedure in a vacuum. They are absorbing pressure, political, personal, sometimes physical. If enough people decide that cost is too high, the institution fails quietly, without a coup, without tanks in the streets. And here's the uncomfortable, contrarian part. The greatest threat to democratic systems is not revolutionaries outside the gates. It's insiders who hollow out enforcement while insisting that norms still exist. You can have courts, elections, and legislatures on paper and still lose the substance of democracy if rules become optional for the powerful. That is not theory. That is observable across history, across regimes, across continents. So when we focus on one judge, one decision, one referral, we miss the larger lesson. The question is not whether the Constitution is strong enough. The question is whether enough people at enough moments are willing to act as if it means something when doing so becomes personally costly, when neutrality feels safer, when silence would be easier, because once enough individuals decide that enforcement is someone else's responsibility, the system doesn't collapse dramatically, it simply thins out. Slowly, unevenly, until one day people realize that the rules still exist, but no longer bind the people who matter most. And at that point, the conversation is no longer about law or institutions, but about power and who is willing to stop it and who is willing to look away, and what that choice reveals about how a society actually understands itself when the abstractions fall away and only human judgment remains in the space where authority is supposed to be exercised. And someone has to decide whether this time, right now, the rules still apply, or whether this is the moment when they quietly stop enforcing them and pretend nothing fundamental has changed, even as the ground beneath them continues to shift and no one is quite sure who will step forward next, or whether anyone will at all. Most political crises fit into familiar lanes. Either their legal battles, or their political fights, or their moments of social unrest. We know how to talk about those. We have language for them. What makes this moment different and genuinely unsettling is that it doesn't stay in one lane. Multiple accountability mechanisms are moving at the same time, independently and with increasing speed. That almost never happens. And when it does, it tells you something important. The system is under stress from more than one direction at once. Start with Congress. Impeachment is a political process by design. It's meant to translate misconduct into democratic judgment. That's normal. What is not normal is impeachment being triggered not by partisan investigation or electoral loss, but by a formal referral from the judiciary itself. That collapses a boundary most Americans assume is firm. Judges interpret law, legislators handle politics. When those worlds collide directly, it's a sign that ordinary guardrails are no longer doing the job assigned to them. Now look at the courts. Judges are not built to escalate. They are reactive institutions. They wait for cases. They issue rulings. They assume compliance. When a judge concludes that contempt powers, fines, and warnings are no longer effective, the judiciary is admitting a structural weakness. Courts do not have armies. They do not have constituencies. Their power rests entirely on legitimacy and enforcement by others. When at breaks down, judges are forced into extraordinary moves, not because they want to be dramatic, but because the alternative is irrelevance. Then add the criminal process. Federal prosecutors operate on a different timeline and logic altogether. They are insulated from elections, largely insulated from politics, and focused on evidentiary thresholds. When criminal investigations proceed alongside impeachment, you get something the framers anticipated but hoped would remain theoretical: parallel accountability tracks, each reinforcing the other, each raising the stakes. That's not redundancy, that's escalation. It means the system is no longer relying on a single corrective mechanism. It's throwing everything it has at the problem at once. And then there's the most revealing signal of all: quiet conversations about emergency constitutional remedies. When serious officials begin discussing measures designed for incapacity or breakdown, not misconduct alone, you know the concern has shifted. The issue is no longer just what someone has done, but whether the system can function with that person continuing to exert influence. That's a fundamentally different category of problem. It's not punitive, it's stabilizing, or at least it's meant to be. Here's the contrarian point people resist. This convergence is not proof of strength, it's proof of danger. Strong systems don't need every mechanism activated at once. They resolve crises sequentially. When everything lights up simultaneously, it means earlier restraints failed. The system is compensating in real time, improvising under pressure, hoping redundancy will succeed where restraint did not. History tells us this pattern appears right before decisive outcomes. Sometimes systems recover, sometimes they don't. What matters is not the number of institutions involved, but whether they reinforce legitimacy or expose its absence. Multiple mechanisms moving together can restore order, or they can signal that no single institution believes it can handle the problem alone anymore. And that's the deeper significance of this moment. It's not that impeachment is happening, or that prosecutors are investigating, or that judges are escalating. It's that all of them independently have concluded that waiting is more dangerous than acting. That judgment, shared across branches that are supposed to distrust one another, is rare. It tells us the crisis has crossed an invisible threshold where caution no longer feels responsible, where delay feels like complicity, where institutions designed to check each other are instead converging on the same conclusion, not because they agree politically, but because the evidence, the behavior, and the consequences have narrowed the range of acceptable responses to the point where doing nothing is no longer a defensible option. And when that happens, the system enters a phase where outcomes become harder to control, easier to miscalculate, and dependent less on design than on how individuals inside these institutions interpret their obligations under pressure, while the public watches, trying to decide whether this convergence represents the last line of defense or the moment when the system quietly acknowledges how close it has come to the edge and how uncertain the ground has become beneath it, as events continue to unfold without a clear endpoint in sight.